Well, yeah. Okay, so I was just saying that we're going to try to use astrology to predict the outcome of a presidential election. And so, how would you go about using astrology to do such a thing? And I was going to say, how do you know if you're right or wrong? But you know eventually whether you're right or wrong. Um, and there's actually this is sort of what astrology in a way is for. Um, or that's how people see the role of astrology is predicting outer world events. One of the things that I say all the time that I don't know if a lot of people understand about astrology is astrology really isn't going to tell you what's going to happen in the outer world. It's going to tell you what you're going to feel or what you'll experience, which is different than the literal outer world phenomena, if that makes sense. Very, very similar, obviously, but not the same. The other thing is trying to answer a yes or no question. Well, or a Donald Trump or Joe Biden question. Um, that's difficult with astrology because ultimately you have to make a judgment call, and how do you do that? Then there's the aspect of free will, which I do think is a big part of our universe and our experience as human beings in time. Um, there's obviously some part of life that has a fate aspect to it. That's why we're studying astrology. That's that's kind of what astrology is talking about. But I also think that we as human beings have free will. Otherwise, there really wouldn't be any point to any of this. We must have free will. And so for something like what is, however many people vote, what are 200 million people gonna choose with their free will, um, is a tricky question because I think the people involved haven't decided yet. The other thing is I've been reading a lot about physics lately, and um, I have up here on the screen quantum uncertainty. And when you get small enough, like down to the level of like atoms and particles, orbiting around atoms kind of thing, there's so much uncertainty built into the universe that they can't even track the tiny parts of these atoms. Um, that I think I think there's a lot of stuff that just in a certain way is up in the air. But what astrology can do really, really well, about any situation is give us the story of the situation. And and astrology speaks in symbols, it speaks in metaphors. And sometimes those it's really clear what those metaphors are saying and how they apply to the real world situation. And other times it's not clear at all. And that's kind of the how it is with astrology. And there's sort of a long-standing reputation with like fortune telling that oracles speak in cryptic tones kind of thing. um the other thing that astrology does is it tells us what's important in our story. It gives us a lot of meaning about why we do things, what we're here to do, what's right for us. And it often is very uncanny in the way your chart can seem to understand you, and vice versa, the more that you know it. So, how do you go about using astrology to predict the outcome of a presidential election? So, I wanted to come back to something we've talked about before that also kind of makes this tricky, is astrology is about your point of view, your experience. You're the center of the universe in astrology. And it's not it's not about those outer literal events so much. You could never leave your house and still, go through Saturn cycles and difficult astrological things. It's just not much maybe happening in the outer world, but in the inner world, this is what you're going to go through. These are the symbols that are powerful in your life right now. And so how do you predict a presidential election doing that? So this is actually a branch of astrology called mundane astrology, and it's the astrology of world events. When I've talked before about the astrology of the COVID virus, that's an example of mundane astrology. And so trying to look at who would win a presidential election is a form of mundane astrology, and it's the same as any other astrology. It's just talking about those world events. So again, back to that, it's your viewpoint that's important in astrology. Um, the to research for this class, I looked up to see what some other people are saying about other astrologers are saying about the upcoming election. And it's interesting because, well, one of them had a bunch of world leaders rather than outright predict the election. They had a bunch of world leaders. And then each paragraph was addressed to a different world leader. It was like Kim Jong-un, this is your year to shine kind of thing. And that's because with astrology, it's really easy to look through someone's point of view, so to speak, through their natal chart, through their birth chart. That helps you understand that person's inner experience. And so it's easy, relatively speaking, to say the themes that are going on in Joe Biden's and Donald Trump's respective lives and the timing of that. Does the information that they give us show enough to be able to say something about how an election is going to go is kind of my exploratory question. And I definitely want to hear from you guys any thoughts that you have as we go over this stuff. So you can do charts. My birth chart is from my point of view. Your birth chart is from your point of view. You can do for mundane astrology, you can do birth charts for countries. Well, just to back up a little bit. So to try to figure out who's going to win an election, what do you look at for a chart? We do have the chart of the country. We have the chart of the candidates. Where do you find that answer? And the answer is you really have to look at all of them. And you really have to look at the story that you're getting and noticing what themes are repeating, that kind of thing. And I think the story that comes out may be a clear answer to the question or a not so clear answer to the question. But it's important to look at this from all of those points of view. USA birth chart. So one of the things that I think is great about using this as sort of like kind of like an exercise is it's very, very clear where to find the presidency in the chart, in anybody's chart. That is the 10th, being the president of the whole country is like the most 10th house possible thing to do. And so we know, even for the USA's birth chart, the president would be in the 10th house. And so we know, even though we're going to look at a bunch of different charts and try to see what are they saying, what's relevant to trying to answer this kind of question. We'll be looking at the 10th house in just about all of them, because the 10th house is career, it's outer structures, it's government hierarchies, that kind of thing. And of course, the president sits at the top of all that. So let's see. Just to talk about the United States birth chart a little bit. So there was an astrologer named Sibley who there's a kind of rectification of charts that you can do if you don't know the birth time of something. And there's also the question of what makes the birth of the nation. Some people might say it was whenever the Pilgrims touched down, or some people, and obviously people were here a long time before that too. How do you make the birth chart of the USA? This guy Sibley came up with, and I don't know his era, but it was a while ago at least. He came up with this birth chart for the US that people have been using. And I would say in astrology, I think it's an exploratory art and science, in the sense of people notice that something works and something's powerful and they keep using it and they keep coming back to it. So going with a tradition like, oh, people have been using this Sibley birth chart for the USA for the past 50 years is actually like a recommendation in its favor, because people are using it and it works. But there's ways that you can he he's just found this chart to work. I don't know how to explain it to with everything else that you haven't learned yet. But so this is the birth chart of the USA. And how would we read that for to ask about a president? One thing that I think is interesting is we look at the 10th house of the country's chart. And so this is the birth chart of the country. And it's outside of time, like any other birth chart. These stories that are in the birth chart, the way these symbols are combining, are going to play and replay throughout the life of the country. But just looking at the USA's birth chart, what does it tell us about even the presidency? So looking at the 10th house, and seeing this as the chart of the American people as a group. Neptune is there and Black Lilith is there. Does anybody have any thoughts about what this might say, what Neptune might say in the 10th house?
Public roles, and
Mm-hmm.
with Neptune being there, kind of like illusion, idealism, kind of like the start of something that was dreamt up by a bunch of people,
Yeah,
and
very
they
much
they
so.
did it.
Excuse me. Very much so. Um, the if you look at wherever Neptune is a place where people maybe tend to not have a lot of clarity, but also great vision. And um, Black Lilith, we've talked a little bit about her. Um, but wherever Black Lilith is like the point in the moon's orbit when it's furthest away from the Earth. And so it carries, it's sort of part of the moon in that sense, or closely connected to the moon. The moon is feelings, and Black Lilith is the furthest away from the Earth, so the most kind of primal base feelings. And so you could understand, looking at the country's birth chart, how does this country approach its leaders? And so we've got Virgo in the 10th house. Virgo primarily, when I think of it as a sign, it's a sign that wants order and predictability. It's an So there's something reassuring that this country, that our country would want from its leaders, that we want our leaders to bring a sense of make things make sense. Um, and Neptune really is doing the opposite of what Virgo's trying to do. And Black Moon Lilith kind of adds like a wild energy to anything that it touches. And so you can you can see how the US, when it was born, was a country that didn't know if it still wanted a king, you know, because there's this need for order and predictability in Virgo. And with Neptune isn't just delusion or confusion, it's also the visions of Neptune. It's also this is a country that could envision, a wonderful leader kind of thing. And so this is what we're tapping into here, is the story of the whole country, from the beginning of the country. And so all presidential elections may have this Neptune, Black Lilith aspect to them. I would say an event like January 6th was very Black Lilithy, in that it was the crowd moving somewhat spontaneously. And so those come from like deep primal feelings. And that sort of thing is suggested by these planets here in the country's birth chart. So I think that's just an interesting thing to notice. Um, so that's the birth of the country. what about um how do we tell about this upcoming presidential election? Like what's going on now with our leaders? So I got the progressed US birth chart, and I don't think I did the transits. So that was an oversight on my part. Um, but we'll look at the progressed chart because that'll tell us the story. So if you remember, progressed charts are they do what's called a day for a year or a year for a day. For every year that this entity has been alive, usually a person, but in this case, a country, you move the natal chart forward a day. And so this is the US birth chart from 1776, but advance it, the country has been around 240 years, say. So this is 200, the chart of 240 days later, so almost a year. So there'll be some movement. We expect to see some movement, um, but some things won't move that much. One thing that's worth noticing, and we certainly in a progressed chart, you always want to look at the sun and the moon, especially the moon, because they move a lot. And the sun and the moon are they're hugely important. I was just telling somebody, a friend of mine over the weekend, um, astrology is very connected to seeing and viewpoint. And whatever you can see is important. It was actually about Black Moon Lilith because this friend of mine had found people on TikTok talking about something about scary Black Moon Lilith placements. Um, and my answer to that was there isn't anything scary about it. It's not Black Moon Lilith is a point in the sky. It doesn't even exist. You can't see it, you can't touch it, which ordinarily wouldn't matter, but in astrology, it kind of matters. What you can see, what's bigger and what's closer, what's right in front of your face is more important because this is about your point of view. Every time you leave the house, you see the sun or the moon usually. Those are the big players. And so you can always, when you're trying to figure out how important a certain message is, the just remember like what's biggest and what's visible from us. Things like asteroids and really distant trans-Neptunian objects, they're part of our consciousness now. Um, but we can't see them from here. And so I think there's always a distinction with that. There's always going to be a difference between looking at something in the sky and looking at something through a telescope. They're just further away and less and have maybe a large effect, but a general sort of effect. Anyway, so this is the US's birth chart, progressed to 2024. I may have gotten this like a year off because the inauguration is actually in 2025. Um, but you can see going right to the 10th house. So this is how the US has developed. The first thing that pops out, look how much Neptune moved in 240 days. It went from 22 degrees of Virgo to 25 degrees of Virgo. But notice something very important. It went retrograde. And retrogrades when they're starting, when that planet is what they call in phasis, where it's a planet that has stopped and is about to turn retrograde, or was retrograde and stops and is about to turn direct. That's when the planet is really activated and really having a more uh, intense effect on everything. And so I think this is a big shift. So we were talking about the US coming in um, from day one as having a Neptune and Virgo approach to the 10th house, to the president. Um, and that Neptune aspect has just intensified in the progress chart. So that's one of the first things to notice. Um, the other thing to notice is this right here. These these little symbols are they're unique. Well, this first one is unique to the Time Passages app. But what this is, it looks like a hamburger. Um, but what it is represents is the progressed ascendant. And so this is a very important part of the chart. And the lot of fortune is here, which is, or the progressed lot of fortune is here also. And so those are noteworthy. So what themes do those bring in? When you've got the ascendant involved, there's the ascendant is both the viewpoint and what the person sees looking back at you. And so it's your face, it's your appearance, but it's also what you see out of the eyes in that face. And so the ascendant is a really, really important point in any chart because it's one of the representations of the thing that the chart is about. And so this puts a lot of focus on the US's progressed 10th house right now. Is what I'd say more the story that's being evolved here. Having the lot of fortune here is a good thing, because the lot of fortune suggests wealth, and it suggests sort of like predestined wealth, that there's like an abundance here for the country also. Um, the other thing to notice is the sun and the moon down here. These are the progressed sun and moon. Out of all the parts of the progressed birth chart, this is the one where the program shows us an aspect. So this is the main focus of what this chart is doing right now. The if you think of the chart as a story in circular form, this part, the fourth house and the 10th house are what lights up. These are the activated parts of the chart. And so I think you could take this to say, well, I think you could take this to say that this is an important time for the US and for elections, and for the presidency, any high ranking office. So we notice the sun and the moon, the progressed sun and the progressed moon, are down here in the fourth house. So the moon represents, in mundane astrology, the moon always represents the people themselves. And so this would be sort of like the voting public. Um, the sun would be, and this is just extrapolated from the parts of the consciousness they are in us. The moon is the feelings, our responses to life. And the sun is kind of like our narration of life, or what we like or don't like about what we see. And so this is both parts of the nation really concentrated and challenging this Neptune and Black Lilith. And so is this a time when when some of the power of of this Neptune Black Lilith thing is being challenged? This is definitely a time where the looking at this progress chart and saying, is this an important election? I think it's telling us that it is. And so we can kind of add that to the story that we have already, just from looking at just the country, from the point of view of the country, because that Neptune is in phasis, because the sun and the moon are opposing it from the fourth house. And what would the fourth house be in a mundane chart? This would be like another, this would be the public. This would also be the land itself. And this is, notice also that the sign that this is all in, that represents the land of the progressed land of the US, is Pisces. And so this is a very the feelings of the people are really, really important right now, is the other part of the story that we're getting. Does anybody have any questions before, I think from here we move on to the candidates chart and talk about what that can tell us?
So Anna, did you take the actual day where we vote?
Oh yeah, that hung me up for a little bit, because I was like, well, what do you set the time to be? Because we're gonna vote on November 5th. But I was, maybe 20 years ago, sometimes you'd know who won an election like by 8 o'clock at night. But usually the last 20 years or so, we've always had close races. So it's not like you could just look at 8 o'clock at night and know.
Right.
And so I don't think there's any time you can associate with it. So what people have very clearly been doing is the inauguration day is always January
Oh,
20th at noon. And so you're really looking, that chart is is good. It's another window through which to look at the question of who wins this. Um, but that's the birth chart really of that presidency. So it's going to tell you what that presidency is going to be like. It
yeah, I
doesn't
was gonna, yeah, no traits of the person, correct?
yeah, they might be in there incidentally.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you're not looking at something that's as helpful at first glance as you might think it is. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just trying to like, is there any other day? I guess it would either be that day or no, or like you said, November 5th. Or what about like doing November 6th,
Yeah,
like the day after
tell you
the res
something that would tell you something too. Although you really want when something begins.
Gotcha.
That's really sort of like when the eye opens kind of thing.
Yeah, the inception of it.
Yeah. And they could announce it at midnight, it's
Yeah.
hard to know.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. So the first chart is Joe Biden's. So what can we get that would tell us about the election from Joe Biden's birth chart? There really isn't that much. Um, we can look at his transits and his progressions for inauguration day 2025, and we certainly will. But one thing that I think is important from the birth chart is it gets us to know that person a little bit. And what is the story that the chart is telling us? What is the story that the um that that this chart is telling us about this person's career, about this person's, and so now we're looking through his eyes a little bit. So one thing I think to notice, and this is where you can kind of do like astrological algebra, is looking at Joe Biden's chart. He's got Sagittarius rising. So he's ruled by Jupiter. And that's the first thing that this chart tells us, and so it's the most important thing that this chart tells us. And so we can walk away with that information in that if we looking at future charts, like looking at charts for election day or whatever, um Jupiter is one of the guises in which Joe Biden shows up. This is sort of the game piece that's been selected for him, if that makes sense. And so where we see Jupiter, we can think of him. In some cases, the you'd have the same ruler. And in fact, Joe Biden being ruled by Jupiter, um, you go back one here to the US birth chart, and the US is also a Sagittarius rising. So the country itself is ruled by Jupiter. And so Jupiter and Joe Biden have sort of the same, um, it's like they have the same game piece. Um,
Anna, can I ask you an elementary question that
oh,
I should know
absolutely.
the answer? Can you remind me how we figure out the rising sign?
Oh, definitely. So you want to look at the part of the chart that if this were a clock, you want to look at where 9 would be. And this
Okay,
line right here. And whichever sign is right here is the sign that's rising. It's the sign that's coming up over the horizon. And
gotcha.
so I
Okay,
drew a 9 over it, but this is Sagittarius.
okay. That makes sense. Awesome. Thank you. I don't think I've ever absorbed that. So
It's one of the hardest things to wrap your mind around with astrology. I don't know why, but it is.
thank you.
You're not alone. One thing I would say is that reading charts, what they do is they give you little pellets of information. Um, the Joe Biden being ruled by the same planet that rules the country, um, that's that's something that you could say is could be the chart suggesting, uniting the two, saying they're represented by the same thing. And so we might get 10 pieces of information that tell us, I don't know, stuff that don't uh pair together Joe Biden and the country. But this is one little, if you think of the scales of Libra, we're putting little pellets on each side. And so it's interesting that these roles have been given to the same actor, so to speak. So that's one thing I would notice from Biden's chart and the US's chart is the ruler. Um, and almost the similarity. And it's almost like um the similarity in that the US has Jupiter in Cancer in its chart, Sagittarius rising. Um, Joe Biden has Jupiter in Cancer, Sagittarius rising. And so there's similarities in the placement of Jupiter as well as well as like the rulership. And so this is saying, Joe Biden and the country are one and the same. Or you could interpret it that way. If the rest of the chart is saying something different, then I would be more inclined to toss it out the window. But that's how the chart is telling the story. Another thing to always note about Jupiter in Cancer is Jupiter is in its exaltation in Cancer, but people say that it's even more powerful in Cancer than it is in its home signs of Pisces and Sagittarius. So when you see Jupiter in Cancer, you think great expansion, huge wealth. It's sort of like a wealth marker. And for it to be um, present in the United States birth chart, and we have been a wealthy country. And essentially this Jupiter in Cancer right here, with Venus right there next to it, kind of sweetening the pot, is really where it's saying that. Um, Biden being ruled by Jupiter also, and Jupiter in Cancer also in the eighth house, which has to do, there's a financial aspect to the eighth house. And there's multiple ways that they got to this in terms of, I think I lost the share. Um, okay. Can everybody see the Joe Biden natal chart?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Um, so we did Jupiter in Cancer. Oh, yeah, there's an association with the eighth house with other people's money. Um, that's because it's the opposite of the second house, which is your money, right? And so the houses are always sort of like a yin yang. And so the eighth house is where you're vulnerable, but it's also the opposite of your money. It's other people's money. Um, the other people is also represented by the seventh house, and the eighth house is the second house to the seventh house, if that makes sense. And a lot of people get very into like turning the chart. But that's a whole tangent, really. But I would say that there's a theme of money and the wealth of the United States that we see already, kind of looking in at the top level of these charts. And it'll be in an ideal world. Well, maybe I can like put it in the chat of essentially what we're discovering. Um, I would say America visionary slash confused about visionary confused slash primal emotions around leaders, especially now. That's kind of like the first thing that this said to us. The Joe, and then the next thing is Joe Biden equated with America and wealth of America. Um, and again, we may get pebbles of evidence that say the opposite. But I'm just sort of assembling the answer that we're getting so far. So we've looked at Joe Biden's ruler. Oh, the other thing that I would look at would be his 10th house. That's the great thing about looking at presidential elections, because it's 10th house all the way down. So since he has the same rising sign as the country itself, he's also got Virgo in the 10th house. His 10th house is empty. One thing to notice is that the North Node is there. Wherever the North Node is sort of like where your destiny lies. Um, the you could this North Node in the 10th house is consistent with saying that someone is destined to be president. You could take it another way, but it's destined for some career, some high office. And so this is another marker in his favor. So I'll add that to the chat of what they're saying. And the terms that the charts are using, we can use moving forward. We know what Jupiter is. And so the message that comes through is really going to build. I don't think I'll even put this in the chat because it's also worth noticing that it's already been fulfilled in the sense of Joe Biden has already attained the highest office in the land. He's already in the presidency. So this isn't saying that you're destined to 2 terms necessarily. So that's another thing to just kind of notice. The other thing would be the ruler of the 10th house. And so we look at Mercury. Mercury here is in the 10th house for him, and it's in Scorpio. Let's see, that's ruled by Mars. Is Mercury happy in Scorpio? It's not in its rulership. It's not in Gemini or Virgo. It's 2 away from its rulership. So this sign right here is ruled by Mercury, and this sign right here. So when something's 2 away, this is how you can figure out planetary dignity without needing a chart, just kind of noticing patterns and interrelations. So 2 away, 2 signs away like this with 1 sign in the middle, this creates a sort of sextile configuration. So Scorpio always sextiles the Virgo. And you can see by these green lines, there's one green line that goes from Scorpio to Virgo. Those are representing sextiles between the planets that are there. But the whole signs sextile each other. And so if you're sextile to your rulership, that's a positive thing. And so Mercury can only be so miserable here. So this is a well-functioning Mercury. Because this is Biden's chart, we would say that we would say that this Mercury represents his career. Scorpio, Mercury is relatively happy there. It's in the 12th house, in which the 12th house is considered like an unfortunate house. So, you have this career that you're destined for, and then where is it? It's over here, kind of lost in the mists of the 12th house, or the deep still waters, because it's Scorpio, of the 12th house. And so I don't know what that means, but again, Joe Biden's already been elected president, and so these have been kind of fulfilled. And it doesn't mean that they couldn't be fulfilled again. It just, we don't know if we're looking at the past in the future. And in fact, with the natal chart, we're looking at past, present, future. This will always look like this. It's the natal chart. So the next logical thing to do is look at the the transits and the progressions for Joe Biden around inauguration day, because it doesn't make sense to do election day. Although if you were doing a full rundown and wanted to look at everything you possibly could, I would take a glimpse at the transits for election day too. And we want to look at, we already know where to go first. There's his ruler. So whoever the ruler is, represents that person. And so even though this is Joe Biden's chart and everything in it is represents Joe Biden, excuse me, the ruler is especially him. Let's see. So we're looking at where Jupiter is in transits, because this is looking at what's going on for him at that time. So he's Jupiter's in the 7th house, and again, this Jupiter represents Joe Biden. It feels like, if looking at his 7th house, he's got Saturn and Uranus in the 7th house. Wherever Saturn is, that person has their biggest difficulties. And so we know that personal intimate relationships have been problematic for him. And in fact, we know from, I don't know, it's probably on his Wikipedia, I know it somehow, that he lost his first wife and I think some of his kids in an auto accident, which is Uranus. It's an unexpected event. And so the difficulties of a personal relationship, the difficulties of intimate relationships are further menaced by Uranus. And so this is very consistent with that. So there's a lot of focus from Joe Biden, him being Jupiter, on this part of his chart at this time. Now the birth chart is eternal. This is just transiting Jupiter. And so the Saturn and Uranus aren't scratch that. We've got to remember that in fact it always goes both ways. It's astrology is see and be seen. So this Jupiter is affecting this Saturn and this Uranus. It's bringing good things to Saturn and Uranus. And so this would be a great time for him in terms of intimate relationships, because Jupiter always brings positivity and always brings good things. But Saturn's effect on Uranus comes back the other. Saturn and Uranus's effect on Jupiter come back the other way. So this would be a good time for what this is saying is a good time for his personal relationships, for his intimate relationships. Maybe a hard time for him. Because this Jupiter is weak, it's in Gemini. And if we look across the way, that's the opposite sign of Sagittarius. And then it's retrograde. And so the outer planets are often retrograde, but it's just another sort of chink in the armor to notice. And so this shows him having a good time in relationships. Hold on. I'm trying to put this in the chat. Hard time overall. And again, that Saturn and that Uranus is messing with Jupiter real time. He's not as good or as well off as he could be, but there's relationship healing happening. So that's just his ruler that's important to look at. Where else would we look with transits? Well, what we really care about is the 10th house. What's transiting the 10th house for Joe Biden on January 20th is the South Node. And you notice he has the North Node of the moon here. The South Node is going to be transiting the 10th house. And so that's like old karma. And that's another something I could put in the chat is old karma coming up. Remember, this is Joe Biden's chart, so this is his point of view. Um, Old karma coming home to roost around career is something like what I would say this is saying. Um, okay. And I'll copy and paste these chats so we can keep them. This is obviously going to be a 2-week thing because we haven't gotten to the other person yet. But those are the big things that I would say are important.
So, Anna, question for you. So when you said like it's like looks like the end of his career, how could you tell like if it's the end of a career versus like having like a life type thing happening or
I don't think I meant to say it was the end of his career, but that old karma would be coming up.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so this is an unfortunate marker here. And
Okay.
if he had any secrets, they'd be coming out. But the United States has a lot of old karma too. But this is
Yeah.
his 10th house, not the United States. And so this would be like they discovered stuff I don't want them to see. It could manifest in that way. Or yeah, it, it's not something that's positive. The North Node is positive, it's your destiny, it's everything's great. North Node is everything that sucks. And South
Yeah.
Node, I mean, is everything that sucks. And that oh, interestingly, he's got Neptune, his Neptune, just a little bit very close to this. This is at 29 degrees of Virgo, and then
Mm-hmm.
this is at 1 degree of Libra. So the South Node and his Neptune are very, very close. And so you can, things like the South Node are great, like little ingredients that let you know how something is going. Um, the this is if there's a place in the chart where Biden is confused, it would be here always because that's where his Neptune is, right? Um, the and this is also where he would be visionary, and so that's sort of for his friends. It's because it's 11th house or his good wishes kind of thing, his hopes and dreams. This is where he's visionary. This is also where he's confused. And here's unpleasant old karma connected to that. This, I would say, is a suggestion of dementia. It's not, it's or something that maybe was held here, it becomes something that's closer to home. Um, and so I would say, in terms of brain health, this isn't a good sign. It's not, it's, I'm trying to like say where this is in the grand scheme of things. The South Node is a tough point. Um, so we'd put in the chat, um, old karma coming to roost around his career, uh, difficult time for his mental clarity. And of course, these mirror things that people already say and are already saying, but to see it written in the chart is always interesting too. Let's see. Oh, it's 7:59. I guess we got to go for now. What do you guys think of this? Is it making sense as I go?
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's fun. And as you can
Yeah.
see, I haven't examined these charts in this way. And so it's all
Mm-hmm.
kind of new to me too.
I
So,
wonder, can you do a chart on the election process?
ooh,
Like if
like
it's
polls
November
open?
5th?
Yeah, you could.
Yeah.
You definitely could. We
Yeah,
could look at
like
that next time. And then,
yeah, I'm just curious.
so if people are worried about like unfairness or hacking or something, would that be present?
Or I guess
You
I'm
could
just
tell us
curious
that.
because I don't even know if either one of the people that we think are going to run are going to end up being our final people.
Oh, it's interesting you mentioned that because one of the things I went and looked at what other astrologers are saying about the election. And one astrologer was talking about how extremely strong Nikki Haley's chart is.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that we could look at too.
Yeah. I'd
Um,
like to her and Kamala too, like just to see where that fits in.
yeah, it's fun.
Very interesting.
And you guys
Awesome.
can
Thank you.
absolutely, and you guys can see this is all the stuff that we've been talking about. And just going in at the when you go in at the topmost layer, because we know what's important, we know we're getting there's no messages in these charts that are more important than the ones that we're picking up, if that makes sense. We're getting the big important stuff. And it's not very hard to do. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Bye
And
bye.
we'll do the other guy next week and see what conclusions we can come to.
Cool. Thanks.
All right.
See if
Bye
we can
guys.
find
Thank
that.
you.
Thank you. Bye.